messy than my talks normally are because it's going to be in a number of parts. One part I just wanted to talk about what syntactic theory is about and what makes it challenging to connect it with artificial language learning and how you might think about that problem. And then, as Jenny said, I'm going to chat a little bit about, initial forays into artificial language learning, how I got kind of interested in that and how my initial thoughts about it were all disillusioned as time went on. And then I'll talk a little bit about the work that Jenny and I and many other people have been doing on this project on Universal 20, and a little bit about where that's heading next. And maybe Alex and Jenny can update, they might have more recent thoughts about this than I do anyway. So it's going to be a very informal kind of chat. And do feel free to just ask me questions. Hopefully you can. I'm not quite sure how that will work, but let's just see how this goes. Okay, just to check, are you guys seeing the next slide, which says, what is syntactic theory for? Okay, so this is just very big picture stuff, but I want to kind of establish at least what my perspective is on this to sort of use that as a way into the question of how to connect syntactic theory with artificial language learning. As Jenny said, I'm kind of interested, I am interested in the particulars of syntactic analysis, and we'll get to some of that later on. But really, I'm kind of interested in syntactic theory because we humans have this miraculous capacity to, which is presumably, it has to be a cognitive capacity that sits in our brains somewhere, which no other species seems to have, and which allows us to do just what I'm doing right now. You will all be aware this is the kind of standard Chomskyan into these kinds of questions, right? Oops, sorry, wrong way around. I take our human syntactic capacity to be our ability to connect grammatical form, right? So there are various aspects to grammatical form. So the order of things, the shape of words, and dependency relationships between elements, to connect that to meaning in an unbounded fashion. Okay, that's just basic linguistics 101. But it's very important when you're thinking about syntactic theory to realize that evidence for the nature of the capacity itself can't be seen directly by looking at that capacity, right? We don't have a direct in to go like, oh, hi, this is what people always want, right? They want a syntactoscope, which you can poke into the brain and go, ta-da, look, we can see the syntactic knowledge somewhere. But we can't do that. We don't actually have, we don't have a syntactoscope, we don't have a memorioscope, we don't have a knowledgeoscope, we don't have any way of addressing most of our psychological capabilities by directly looking at the capacities. Okay, so we can't look at the capacity itself. Rather, the way that we get at the human syntactic capacity is by building theories about the generalizations that we can find about what are at least putative outputs of that capacity, right? So rather than being able to look at the thing directly, we look at behaviors in some fashion, okay? And we assume or argue that these behaviors are outputs of the syntactic capacity, and there a lot of controversy lies, okay? And once we've done that, we try and figure out what the generalizations are, okay? Now, as time has gone on in syntax, our ways of looking at the outputs of the capacity have improved. I think they've massively improved over the time I've been doing syntax anyway. So what we, of course, traditionally use are informal judgment tasks, right? Which are just language users, including babies, acquirers, reactions to or judgments of presented data in particular languages. Notice how far that is from what we actually are trying to build a theory of, right? But that's what so most of syntactic theorizing has depended upon, oh, can you believe it? Someone's at the door. I'm just going to grab the door while you think about this. I'll be back in 2 seconds.
What a strange age we live in.
It really is a whole new world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, flow not broken at all. Just continuing, as you said, after my nice discussion with the postman. So yeah, so normally we can use informal judgment tasks, and of course we can use formal judgment tasks, and that's been something that has been growing massively over the last decade or longer. And of course, you know, there's a big argument again to the extent to which we need formal experimental tasks over informal ones, right? So that's the argument between you know, Sprouse and numerous people from Ted Gibson's lab, and you know, that's the sort of general set of issues. I mean, the way I kind of think about it is that we can get an awful lot done with informal judgment tasks, right? But notice again, as I said, you know, it's quite far this from the human syntactic capacity, right? Just what particular judgments of presented data are in particular languages when we're trying to find out about language. Okay, so another kind of evidence that has been used, of course, is online and offline processing. I don't know why I said offline processing. Anyway, online processing of presented data in particular languages. So reaction times, priming, eye gaze, neural signals, all that kind of stuff, which I must admit is an area that I have not really been involved in, but that's certainly other kinds of evidence you can use. And a final kind of evidence, which has you know, become very important in syntactic theorizing over the last 3 decades maybe, is the nature of typological patterns across languages. Right, so that began to be, I mean, it's always been important in generative syntax, but it began to be very important, you know, during the late 70s and 80s, when it appeared to be the case that particular kinds of patternings emerged when you looked at different kinds of languages, and those patternings appear to have inferential relationships between them. So if you do X, you do Y. And also putative gaps emerging. So no language does Z, okay? And so that became, of course, a very important kind of data, which feeds off of the first kind of data, right? The judgments in particular languages, to build something larger. But is there an experimental way into that, right? Is there an experimental way into addressing the way that typological patterns and typological gaps emerge, right? So, and that's where I think artificial language learning became, at least for me, was a potentially exciting way of thinking about that question, that particular kind of data, because of course these typological patterns are a bit closer, in a sense, to, you know, the thing that we want a theory of. Right? They're a bit closer to the nature of the human syntactic capacity than particular data in particular languages, where it's harder to make, you know, universal claims, right? What you really need to do is to be looking across languages to make those more general claims. So, so that's partly the reason that I got interested in artificial language learning as perhaps a way of experimentally addressing this set of issues that began to emerge in the 80s and onward from there. All right, so so that's just sort of that's the sort of context that I want to set in. Now I want to talk about problems that emerge before we even begin to do that. So let's take a very simple case like the English sentence in 1, right? Which woman did the children tell you, and then was and not were hungry? Okay, at least in standard dialects of English, right? So obviously in some dialects of English, you might get something different, but most varieties will give you this, okay? So what's going on there, okay? So there's a very general theoretical claim, which is agreement is never with the linearly preceding noun phrase, okay? And that means that you're not going to get where in one as agreement with you. Okay, why is that? In this particular case, it's because you're going to get agreement with the trace of which woman, right? So there's a dependency between which woman, okay, and that lower verb, which leads to that lower verb being inflected as singular, okay, and not as a singular third person, and not as second person, as you see the immediately preceding pronoun you is. Okay, so the explanation for one, okay, depends upon there being a movement dependency going on. You don't really need to say this is movement. You can think of movement as a metaphor here. All syntactic theories, whether they think there's movement or not, have this question that they need to deal with. Okay, and I mean, at least within generative linguistics, this is a general theoretical claim, right? That really the agreement is with the moved subject in this case, because agreement in English is with subjects and the subject has moved. Okay, an agreement is not with the linear preceding DP. So you might imagine that you could address this kind of universal claim, not just by looking at lots and lots of languages and analyzing them, but perhaps via an artificial language learning paradigm. Okay. So how might one do this? I haven't done this. I'm just using this as a way of thinking about the problems that emerge when you try to investigate syntactic theoretical explanations using artificial language learning. So you could do something like this. Is something you could imagine. Okay. So you might first of all find a bunch of monolingual speakers whose language is obligatorily WH and C2 and which lacks agreement. And we have lots of speakers of such languages around, right? That's a typologically common kind of language. That is, you don't move WH elements and you don't have agreement. Those two things are not tied together, but it's just, I mean, Mandarin does this, for example. Lots of Sino-Tibetan languages look like this, okay? Now you can imagine teaching those individuals an artificial language where that artificial language has subject-verb agreement, right? Unlike their native languages, okay? Where the data is ambiguous, the data we feed them is ambiguous between linear and structural conditioning of subject-verb agreement, right? That is, in all of these cases, we would feed them information which would not allow them to come to a generalization on the basis of the data that the agreement we see in a verb is triggered by something which is structurally adjacent to that verb or linearly adjacent to that verb. We could also have some NPs not agree, so that would be a very typical thing to do. So you could say that singular would give you zero agreement versus plural would give you some affixal agreement. And then you would also teach them independently data where we show them there's movement. That is where WH elements are placed in scope positions. Okay. Again, ignore the singular there. I think that's from a draft. Okay. So this is this kind of Jenny said.
Doesn't the singular make sense, David? Because you would want to teach them a case where the agreement isn't there because it's zero agreement.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. Sorry. Yes, it does make sense actually. Okay, so this is so Jenny said to me that before I started this, that you guys have been talking about these held out paradigms as a means of tackling syntactic questions, and that's the paradigm we'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about U20 effects. But you could see how you could build a held out paradigm here. That is, they would know there's agreement and they would know that there is WH movement, but they wouldn't know what you would do when you WH extract from an agreeing position, okay? And then you could organize things in this language so that basically there would be a linearly preceding NP, like the English example we saw before, but also there would be a trace, okay? And then the question would be, how would they generalize? So this, I mean, I literally came up with this very, very quickly, right? This isn't meant to be a detailed experimental proposal here is meant to be a sketch of the kinds of things that you would think about if you were trying to address this general theoretical question of, does agreement happen with something that is structurally linear or with something that is structurally present but not linearly present? Okay, so that would be one way to address this. You know, I haven't designed this in any great depth because I, as a theoretical syntactician, will always work with people who know about experimental design, who will manage to make this a little bit sharper. So, but my point here is not really this. This is just a sketch. My point is that actually, this is already problematic. It looks fairly straightforward, but it's already problematic. Why is that? Well, we know that some languages have zero agreements. When I say zero agreement, what I mean is agreement is default in terms of it's usually third singular, usually masculine, although that's not always the case, sometimes feminine, like in classical Arabic. So some languages have these reduced agreement cases in situations where the agreement element is structurally connected. I said here followed, but that's because I'm thinking of VSO languages. They're structurally connected to a gap of some sort. So actually in such situations, we know there's a typological class of languages where you would actually expect there to be zero agreement when you extract, unlike in English, right? Now, it turns out that the evidence in these languages is that it's not a trace in this position. It's rather a null pronominal in this position. Partly that's because you find these languages are generally pro-drop languages, and they generally allow resumptive type of approach to what looks like WH extraction. But the evidence is syntactic evidence that this is really a pro and not a trace. And it comes from all sorts of things you cannot do, very easily at least, with artificial language learning, right? So the evidence comes from things like reconstruction in binding effects, right? Which is not something that's very straightforward to handle in artificial language learning. The general point is that, like, you know, it's the whole grammar that gives rise to this particular patterning we see, right? But it's hard to test a whole grammar because, of course, as you build extra stuff into your artificial language learning, you're building more and more hypotheses in, and it gets harder and harder to teach the subjects because there's far more for the subjects to handle. So they're probably, even with something as simple as this, right? And this is a fairly, you know, big claim. It's not even particularly connected with a particular syntactic theory, right? So all syntactic theory is going to have to say something that is like this, right? But all syntactic theories are also going to have to deal with the fact that there is a small but present typological class of languages where we have the anti-agreement effect, right? So that's a problem. And the problem is really generally that there are multiple analyses available for surface forms. And if you're trying to test the principles behind those analyses, they can't be too abstract. And that is a problem because even for something that looks fairly, oops, gosh, how did that happen? Even for something that looks fairly non-abstract, like this, it is really quite abstract. And much more generally, syntactic theory gets its power from its abstractness, okay? So I'm just going to give you a bunch of, you know, I'm going to give you a bunch of, I'm going to give you a little discussion here about the depth of the abstractness that syntactic theory needs even to get anything off the ground, as a kind of cautionary tale here. And you might think, David, you're just telling us you can't do artificial language learning with syntax. And I'm not, because then I'm going to move to a situation where I think you can. But I do want to, like, I mean, and I'm telling you this because my initial thoughts of this were like, yay, this is really cool. We can test all sorts of stuff. And and as I began to push harder into this area, I began to realize actually you really need to choose the things you test very, very carefully so you don't waste your time on things that are too abstract. That's really the motto of this first chunk. So I'm going to give you a little bit that you probably all know, but I think is not really said enough about the abstractness of what syntactic theory is from the get-go. And I'll give it to you through a situation that emerges from three. But before we get to this, does anyone have any questions they want to ask about my initial cautionary tale? No? Okay. I mean, I can't tell whether there's... Oh, Jenny has a question.
I mean, other than to say that when David and I were talking before, I was like, I think we can probably test this. So just to count up, like it.
Yeah, so we can. I mean, so we talked very briefly. I raised this as a thing, and then I think that we probably can work out some of those problems. And it probably is quite a cool little test. But I want you guys to just see that, like, the challenges that emerge. It's not, and I think this is one of the things that the Jenny and I, when we worked together, came across more and more often, which is, you know, Jenny would say, oh, we could do this. And Klaus and I would go, well, there are languages where you do blah, 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 right? And so this is like, you know, yeah, and Jenny's like, arg. So this is a thing to think about, right? Which is actually, in a sense, a call for multidisciplinary working in this, which is, you know, syntacticians generally know a lot about a lot of weird languages that, you know, that allow you to hone down and make much more tight the ways that you can design experiments. All right, I'm just going to give you another case, which I think is yet more challenging. And this is really to just talk a little bit about, you know, again, the issue of abstractness. So this is a very typical type of example that you will see in halfway through intro syntax textbooks. In fact, I think this is in chapter 8 of my 2003 book, for example, right? Which woman did you wonder when left? So if you, even if you ask Ted Gibson this, he will say, yeah, that's not very good, right? So like there are, this is just a fact, right? As opposed to something that, you know, you can think, oh, I need to do a gazillion experiments on. These are not good sentences in English. Now, if you ask a syntactician why this isn't good, you know, the syntactician will say something like, oh, it's ungrammatical because the WH subject has been extracted from the lower subject position across a filled specifier of CP, and that violates a locality condition on its relationship with its trace, right? And everyone who's not a theoretical syntactician around will look like that, right? So, and I think that the reason that syntacticians say this is because they have a theory about what's going on. But the reason that psychologists are asking the question, I mean, that's not a good answer to a psychologist who's asking that question, right? And the answer, you know, our philosophers say. So, you know, I mean, I've taken this example from a forthcoming paper where I've been having a little backwards and forwards with some philosophers in Language and Mind about, you know, what syntax is. You know, the philosophers are just like, what? You know, when you say that. And it's perfectly reasonable for them to be like, well, what a syntactician really means when she or he says for is, okay, this is long, right? It's kind of worthwhile going through. So a speaker of English encountering 5, which woman did you wonder when left, will judge it as unacceptable because they go through the process, right? So first of all, they connect elements of the physical signal that they hear or they see with particular internal grammatical structures, which are fragments of the whole structure, which we can think of as the basic lexical items, given in the particular order of those lexical items we can see in 5. The crucial point that the syntactician then comes in and says is, when the speaker of English encountering this does this, their internalized grammar is unable to generate a structure, the yield of which has those lexical items, has the particular lexical items that the speaker has identified in that presented order and form, okay? And specifically the structural relationship between the subparts of the structure, which women and left is I've given you, sorry, I put R there, and that's like an attraction error, you know, is disallowed by the speaker's grammar, And that's why the speaker's grammar can, for example, build parts of that structure, but is unable to build a whole structure, the yield of which gives you 5, right? So the speaker's grammar fails to generate the structure for 5, and that's what explains the reaction. So notice that what's going on there is that the bit that's relevant, the bit that the syntactician said in 4 there, is a tiny subpart of actually what the whole process is of giving a judgment. Now you guys all know this, but it does mean, if you think about it, that actually, whenever we're doing a piece of syntax, right, we're really abstracting away from an enormous amount of stuff. We're abstracting away from, our using these judgments, we're abstracting away from a ton of things, right? So what we're doing is we're doing an initial transduction from the acoustics to some kind of phonetics. And by transduction, what I mean is we're mapping these computationally totally arbitrary physical events out in the world, right, to something which is computationally relevant, right? That is some kind of universal phonetic structure, which presumably connects with actual brain states, okay? And those are computationally relevant, right? Those are physical events. So this is a transduction in classical transduction sense, but they're physical events which then computation takes place on. Phonological computation, and eventually, you identify the lexical items, then you begin a syntactic computation, okay? So there's an enormous gulf, in a sense, that we syntacticians don't even talk about between what's happening in terms of the presentation of something like 5 and what we're doing with it. Okay. So, like being a bit more detailed about this, right? What we need to think about is that we've got a whole bunch of hypothesized lexical items. Those lexical items are linking phonological with syntactical semantic information. The phonological information is already got by a fairly complex phonological computation from the universal phonetics, which is got by some transduction from the acoustics, okay? And then there's syntax beyond that, right? So the syntax really is very far from the presentation of the information. And all of that needs to be thought of before we can even get something as concrete as that judgment out. So, how then do we get to an explanation of 5 once we've done all of this stuff, right? Once we've mapped from the acoustics to universal phonetics, and then from the universal phonetics through a phonological computation to a phonological structure, then from a phonological structure to accessing a lexical item, which may well be affected by things like the frequency of that lexical item, by expectations of the context about, where we've recently heard stuff, about the availability of that lexical item, about its ambiguity, and so on. So we are collecting all of these particular lexical items, and then we need to run the syntactic computation on that. Once we've done that with all of these various kinds of lexical items, predicting through the ongoing parse what the next lexical item is likely to be, given all those factors that I just mentioned, then we eventually get out something which we can represent like a structure, as you see there above 8. That structure, if you ask your semanticist, has a perfectly well-formed semantics attached to it, right? That's the semantics attached to that structure. That is the interpretation that is given by the other aspects of the mind to that structure, is something like, who is the woman X, such that you wonder for what time Y, X left at Y. Perfectly valid structure, but as we all know, not a good sentence, right? Why? Well, now you go back to what the syntactician initially said, and one theory of this, and there are many theories, one theory of this is that in that structure you see there, the lower part of the dependency, which woman creates in the structure when it moves, is that the lower part is not accessible somehow to the higher part unless the trace of that lower part is immediately dominated by, and I've used that as, I mean, that's probably not true, but as a simplification, by a particular kind of category CP. How the hell are you going to test this using an artificial language learning paradigm? Right, when you think through all of the levels of abstraction that we need to get through. So, you know, this is again just a cautionary tale to select the relevant generalizations at the relevant level. Okay, and it may be the case that once you find generalizations, that you can connect them to these larger theoretical claims, but that set of connections is a fairly long set of inferences, and that's something to be very wary about. Okay, so that was really, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to go through this is this connection to the abstractness for ALL, but I also want to mention it to draw a distinction between what the syntactic theory is doing for you as a static body of knowledge which tells you about how particular structures are well formed or not, and how that is distinct from how we get to those structures in any particular occasion of use. Okay, so I'm going to now go away from that set of cautionary tales and actually talk about things which I think you can be successful with. And I want to sort of now go to more personal kind of level. So where did my initial excitement about ALL come from? So I heard a talk at NYU when I was visiting NYU, giving some, I think I was teaching Kane's advanced syntax class at the time, and someone had come to give a talk about artificial language learning. It was on kind of morphosyntax, I think. I can't really remember very much about it, to be honest. But I remember thinking, well, you know, the kinds of things that I think are interesting are these gaps. So the kind of gaps I just talked about, right? Why don't we have languages that violate the kinds of, you know, abstract principles that you see here? Can we test those using artificial language learning? And one of the things I've been teaching in this advanced syntax class was something like Cinque's, was you know, my theory of Cinque's theory of his universal 20 stuff. And I'll talk a bit about universal 20 in a second. So I asked the speaker if anyone had applied such ideas to gaps in word order generalizations, which seemed to me to be quite amenable to these kinds of to artificial language learning approaches. And the person said, oh yeah, that's all been done. This universal 20 stuff that you mentioned, it's been done by Jenny Culberson. You should read her stuff. And I was, so I looked around in Jenny's stuff and I couldn't see anything that addressed universal 20. And I emailed Jenny and she said it had been on her mind, but she'd been looking at universal 18 mainly, which is the stuff that you probably know about, which is harmony, about which modifiers appear on which side of the noun phrases, and the fact that they tend to harmonize in particular kinds of ways in terms of order. And she was keen in thinking about it, but she hadn't really figured out how to do demonstratives at the time, hadn't really thought about it in enough depth. And so we just continued an email conversation about this. And I was like, oh, maybe we could do this. And Jenny was like, no, you can't do that. And we had like long discussions about this. And then I found some money and I said, Jenny, why don't you come to London and we will talk this through. And so that's what we did. The reason I was interested was for two reasons. One reason was the particular question of gaps, but it wasn't just the question of gaps. It was the question of, you know, those gaps are gaps, and Cinque's theory really says they are true gaps. Universal grammar doesn't allow you to generate languages that look like this. But of course, they might just be statistical gaps, right? And I was interested in this question independently because of work that I've been doing with Jen Smith, where we were looking at sociolinguistic variation, where we also saw gaps that looked statistical, right? You definitely thought, you know, more likelihood that you'd say X versus Y, and zero likelihood, well, I mean, it looked like zero likelihood that you would say Z. So for example, in the Scots variety Bucky, in 10A, you can say things, Jen collected data like we was happy and we were happy, but she didn't collect data. All of the data she had is they were happy and not they was happy. So it looks like there is a gap, right? And if you test this with judgment tests, speakers don't like it. And I built some kind of a theory of this that said, you know, the grammar doesn't generate it. It's not just that it's very unlikely the grammar doesn't generate it, but within sociolinguistics, there sort of wasn't a way of saying that, at least within the standard approach. The standard approach was to assign probabilities to variable rules, and the probability is a zero probability, or maybe not zero, very low probability, right? So I'd come up with a way of saying, actually, you know, the grammar gives you a particular envelope, and that variability lies outside that envelope. And I was interested in seeing whether ALL was a way of doing this at the typological level, right? It isn't, or it isn't possible in any kind of way we've been able to figure out. But in my deep naivety at the time, I thought there was. So, you know, that's basically what I just said. Are there categorical gaps? You know, but I do think that we got some way into this. So, and I think it was sort of serendipitous the way we did this, because there are a bunch of ways that the gaps can arise. So one way the gaps could arise is, are they outside of the province of grammar? Or are they possible but just unlikely? Or are they just accidental? Are they just the emergence of historical processes? And I think we got to a point of saying that if it's historical processes, it's not accidental ones, okay? So I think we have been able to say that, at least. So we've kind of gone a small way into that. So very briefly, I'm going to run through this because you guys probably know most of this, and I want to leave some time for questions. Again, you know, please stop me if there are questions. Universal 20, you probably all know, basically is about things like these 5 big boxes: demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun. So when any or all of the when any or all of the modifiers precede the noun, they tend to be in the order I've just given. When they follow the reverse order is most common, but other orders are common, okay, when they follow the noun. So Dreyer has argued that actually, you know, there are some languages where you have demonstrative, adjective, numeral, noun. Davedian English, he argues for this. Although I had some email conversation with Chinqui recently, and he's said that in the sample where he's looked, actually these languages are merely alternate orders within another order which does follow U20, and he argues that these are cases of focus movement. So it may be the case that actually these are not base word orders, and U20, as stated in 12, stands. So there's a bit of debate about this right now, but that's a sort of interesting question. And actually, these are interesting orders for the work that we did, as I'll mention later on. So the theoretical context of this is that there is a universal structure for noun phrases, which we can think of as closeness to the noun. Okay, who knows where that universal structure comes from? Jenny and I have different views on this. Well, she has a view, I don't have a view. And you know, the way that this hierarchy where the adjective is closest to the noun and then the numeral, then the demonstrative works out in terms of word order is that there's a very simple mapping to be got by associating each layer in the hierarchy with the 2 logical orders in that layer. So you essentially flip the hierarchy around its axis, and that will give you 8 orders that emerge if you do that, which we called homomorphic orders, okay? And there's a typological reason to think that that particular hierarchy is not crazy, in that these orders account for the vast majority of the world's languages, okay? So there's something about that order. This isn't just some random distribution. There's something about that particular hierarchy that maps to orders in a particular kind of way. So we initially addressed this. We were like, oh, this is really exciting. And we designed a bunch of experiments using Glurmy, who was Jenny's alien at the time. Do you remember Glurmy? And Glurmy.
Do I remember Glurmy?
Yeah, I know.
Of course I do.
And Glurmy like spoke an alien language, but the thing is, the subjects found it very difficult to learn. And then Jenny had the really brilliant idea of making it easier to learn by using English words, right, to deal with that learning difficulty. And I think initially, Jenny, you can correct me if it's wrong, this was really just a way to deal with the learning difficulty. But we had the realization that actually, and this was kind of serendipitous, this allowed us to make an argument about whether language learners stored these representations in the hierarchical way that universal grammar or whatever gives you, versus the linear way where we say that the representations are stored in terms of statistical transitional probabilities. Now, linguists do not believe that things are stored in terms of statistical transitional probabilities, but psychologists really believe that. They think that that's how we store, many psychologists, I should say. That's how they think we store things. I mean, when I chatted to my local psychologist here in Queen Mary about our ALL experiment, which I'll tell you about in a second, they were like, yeah, so they all went in this direction. And I was like, no, they all went in the other direction, right? So the psychologists, you know, the ones who don't generally work in language, they really buy that. So this is actually an important thing. So, you know, for example, Frank et al., who are actually linguists and should know better, but they think that linguistic structure is fundamentally linear. And the rules we see are sort of side effects of transitional frequencies between words, or perhaps between word categories, and basically what's on the surface determines what's inside, and how you store your linguistic knowledge is, you know, a side effect of your storage of transitional probabilities, right? So the transitional probabilities are the core thing, okay? So that's a little diagram from Frank et al. That, like, you know, you've basically got these transitional probabilities between particular categories, and then you can organize these in streams, which basically mimics rules. But anyway, they really think the transitional probabilities are the core element. Whereas, you know, most linguists will say it's what we just said already. There's a hierarchy. So what we did, Jenny, have you talked about this already? No. So what we did was we essentially had Jenny basically designed this experiment where we have a bunch of conditions, and the conditions involve training combinations with 2 of the modifiers, holding out combinations with 3 of them. So we don't teach them the 3 of them. And participants were assigned to condition. So they saw things in English, like they would see that shoe and they would hear a translation of it into Glurmy's language or some artificial language, shoe that, box is green. And they had to click on one of the options to say what they heard. So all they're doing is learning basically what's going on with examples of a single modifier. And then at tests, they have to translate what would happen with more than one modifier, right? So how would the speaker say that striped scarf? Would they say striped that scarf, that striped scarf, scarf that striped, or scarf striped that? Okay. So and you can see what's going on here, right? Which one are they going to choose? The one that is homomorphic with the hierarchy is scarf striped that. Okay. The one that is most like English transitional probabilities, okay, is scarf. Well, obviously it's the English one, right? But if they've learned anything about this language, they learn the noun comes first, right? So the one that's most like the English in terms of transitional probabilities between the modifiers is scarf that striped, right? Because you say that striped in English, okay? So so these are the 2 hypotheses, right? What do? Ta-da! They all love hierarchy, right? In general, they overwhelmingly prefer the order which is derivable from the hierarchy, as opposed to the linear order. Okay, so if we store knowledge based on linear transitional probabilities, this is unexpected, which everyone but linguists thinks, which is why we managed to publish it in PNAS, right? Basically because, you know, that's a surprise. It's a surprise to most psychologists, and not to linguists, because linguists know about these things. Now, there is a question, of course, which is, could this be an extra linguistic effect of reversal? That is, have the participants learned, oh, this is just a reversal, right? It's a game. It's not actually drawing upon their language capacity. Okay. We argued in that paper it was unlikely because there was a much stronger effect between the adjective and the demonstrative than there was between the other ones. And we said that that suggests some kind of effect that's connected to structure, that is, the adjective and demonstrative are structurally distant, not linear order. Although, of course, we have no idea how to say that theoretically beyond, oh, they're very far apart, right? So it's a kind of weird explanation. But, you know, that's what we suggested at the time. Now, it turns out that when we looked, and this is work done with Alex and others, when we looked more carefully at what the speakers said they were doing, quite a few of them said that they were reversing what's going on, right? So we replicated, again, when I say we, I really don't mean me. People who know how to do these things replicated them using English speakers and Thai speakers, but this time with a true artificial language, which was designed. How do you use we exclusively? This is an interesting pronoun we don't have, right? This is we, not meaning me. Okay, so how do we do this? We want to design a language which was usable across English and Thai. Okay, so we designed it so the phonology worked for these, and across Kitaraka, which is another language I'll talk about in just a little bit. Oh my God, it's 11:27. So that's how we. So we did this, and that, of course, and then we checked with speakers to see what they did, right? And the chances that they would be just reversing things were still there. They could have just been reversing things, but it turned out that actually they weren't. That's not what they reported they were doing. They were engaging their language learning capacity in learning this language rather than some general, you know, game playing capacity. And we got the same results, okay? And interestingly, we got the same results again with a stronger effect between the adjective and the demonstrative, which is again interesting. Okay, so that's what that all says. And I think what that says is that really these experiments together really do show that the explanations of U20 gaps that attribute them to some random historical set of events, are wrong. There seems to be some bias, some true bias in human cognition that says, yeah, we really do like to, when I say cognition, in English speakers and in Thai speakers, I should say, where those speakers really do like to say that what's going on is there's some kind of bias towards a homomorphic, towards a hierarchy-based mapping to order, okay? Of course, this doesn't address the question that I, at least, was interested in, about whether those biases are strong, in a sense, whether they're categorical, right? Whether UG, you know, sort of basically says those gaps are gaps, right? Or whether they are probabilistic. Okay. So just briefly finishing this off, we are currently finishing, and this seems to have taken forever and ever and ever because of COVID, we're currently finishing a set of cases where we're looking at one of the languages which is not homomorphic, because you won't remember, but if you looked at that typological Klein I gave you, there were a bunch of languages within the most common ones which are not homomorphic, that is, which are not gettable from the hierarchy via just simply linearizing the hierarchy. And so one of these languages is Kidaraka, which is a Kikuyu Kamba language spoken in central Kenya. Again, a little map of it there. We went on a trip. Oh, it seems so long ago now, and look how sunny and lovely it was. There's me and Jenny and Alex and Patrick, who did a massive amount of work with us in Kenya and since on this language, which is a language which is not homomorphic. And so the reason for doing this is trying to see well, actually, I'll show you the language first and you can see why. For the experimental work, we needed monolingual speakers, right? And the reason for that is we needed speakers who had no languages in their heads, which were basically like English, right? Actually, any languages are best, but certainly no languages like English, because the order we are going to test is an order where the English order is the crucial one, right? So we needed to check monolingual speakers. That required us to go to this fairly rural area. And have we finished the data collection now, Jenny? Okay, we're there, right?
We'll see.
Okay, we'll see. We're in the tail end of data collection, right? Okay, so let me tell you about this language. This is a very cool language for what we wanted to look at, right? So in this language, the N is closest not to the adjective, but to the demonstrative, okay? So there you see, I will carry these 5 big boxes, and you see it's box these 5 big. Now, that's the surface order these speakers will have heard all their lives. Hopefully they won't have heard other orders. There is a very small order where you can have the demonstrative before box, but that doesn't seem to be a base order. So it seems to be an order, we haven't figured it out yet, where we're somehow emphasizing the demonstrative, okay? But generally what we find is that we get noun, demonstrative, adjective. Now, if there's a surface hierarchy here, that hierarchy, if it's a surface one, will have the box and the demonstrative being closest to each other, and then 5, okay? Further, this is an order we cannot get by simply permuting the units of the universal hierarchy. Just, there's no way of doing it, right? So either we've got surface order, or we've got flatness of structure, or we've got something funky going on, such that really box is pronounced in somewhere where it syntactically is not. That is, it is really closest to the adjective, and then we've had some syntactic movement, like the syntactic movements I discussed earlier on in this talk, which has fronted, in some sense, that noun, okay? So we can't really test whether we've got syntactic movement in an ALL paradigm in any kind of obvious fashion. So what that requires is figuring out whether the syntax of this language is a language where box and demonstrative are linearly related, hierarchically related, or not related in a deep sense, but rather box and the adjective are related in a deep sense. Okay, so we can do this, and if we do, it will tell us whether the hierarchy is there even in non-homomorphic languages, which will really allow us to say that this is a cognitive bias as opposed to some accidental bias. So if those speakers end up learning or extending the generalizations about the relationship of modifiers to noun in the language they're learning in such a way as they get a homomorphic result as opposed to a linear result, okay, that will tell us that really their cognitive biases, even though their linguistic data is, is not what the cognitive biases suggest, that will tell us the cognitive biases are somehow active, okay? So that's what we're looking at from an experimental behavior. From a syntactic behavior, Klaus and I think that the hierarchy is active, and we are obviously, because that's what we think. And obviously we're looking to see whether that's really true or not. I should tell you, my initial hunch as a syntactician was that actually languages like Kitharaka would be outside of the hierarchy. That is, that really adjectives and numerals in such languages and demonstratives are not really adjectives and numerals directly like they are in English. They are something else. Okay, so I pursued so that means that we can just put Kitharaka aside, right? Which, you know, makes the experimental approach more challenging, right? Because then they're a different kind of language, all right? So really figuring out what the syntax is doing is really crucial to figuring out how to interpret the experimental results, okay? And luckily I was wrong, right? That was my initial feeling, but I think that it turns out that I was wrong about that initial feeling. In it, I mean, you know, so, which is great, right? And I think we'd even figured out I was wrong by the end of the field trip, right? So that was kind of really interesting. So one of the core cases at the end of the field trip that we got to, and we refined this since, is that is it from ellipsis. And I'm briefly going to present this to you and then we'll more or less finish. So Kitharaka, it turns out, allows ellipsis of a noun stranding an adjective, just like English, right? In English, you can't, when I say just like English, in English, you can't really delete the noun, but you replace it with something like one. So these 5 black sticks and those 5 red broke is perfectly fine in Kitharaka. In English, you say red ones, okay? These 5 black sticks and those 5 red ones, but in Kitharaka, you can just delete the noun. This is interestingly true irrespective of the order of the numeral and the adjective, which is something else that we need to deal with. But notice it's really crucial you can delete the noun. Now, it turns out that in examples without demonstratives, we see a very clear signature of the hierarchy when we leave out an adjective in the preceding noun phrase versus a numeral. So have a look at 16, right? I will carry, okay, boxes, madandaku, madatu, 3, manini, big. So we've got boxes, 3, big, and mutegi will carry 2, okay? Now, what we get very strongly in such cases is that this means 2 large boxes, not 2 boxes. So we picked up from the previous noun phrase the adjective big. And it's an interesting question why we have to do that, but it seems like a very strong effect, okay? So I will carry 6 large boxes and Mutegi will carry 2, see in English as well, all right? 2 large boxes, okay? Now, if we compare this to what happens if we do the following. So I have carried 20 big boxes, but you haven't carried small. Now remember, you know, you can leave a noun out after the adjective. That's what we showed initially. So I have carried boxes, large, and then murongeyeri, which is 20, but you have not carried small. Now that can't mean 20 small boxes. That can't mean, so if you could imagine that what we deleted in this case is the numeral plus the noun, just like we deleted the adjective plus the noun in the previous case. But that's not possible. So the generalization is you can elide a constituent containing the adjective and excluding the numeral, but not vice versa. And what that shows, here's a little tree for you guys, what that shows is that we can elide the thing that large modifies, just boxes, but we oops, I haven't given you the other tree, but we can't elide, why have I not given you the other tree? That's annoying. Sorry, guys. But what you can't do is just elide the thing after the numeral, which would contain, right, the NP there, large and boxes, right? We can't do that. So that is exactly what the hierarchy predicts. The hierarchy says the numeral is higher than the adjective, So when you elide something after the numeral, you can elide the adjective as well. And in Kitteraka, it seems you must elide the adjective as well. That is, you recover the adjectives, right? But when you are just deleting a numeral, you're just deleting a numeral. You're not eliding something. Okay, so something else is going on. It's exactly what the hierarchy predicts. I think I commented out the wrong slide. It's very annoying. My apologies. It turns out that this confused us for ages, Klaus and I. It turns out that that same effect doesn't emerge when you have the demonstrative in place. And that's actually for totally independent reasons. And those are reasons you see in English as well, which have got to do with the pragmatics of demonstratives. So it turns out we can see that the hierarchy is there in the absence of the demonstrative. Okay, so we've got a ton of other arguments, which I'm not going to go through, with all of which point in the direction that there is a hierarchy. Unfortunately, Klaus and I have still not got to a point where we are happy with what our final analysis of Kitteraka nominal phrases is. We've been trying out lots of different approaches, and each time I come up with one, Klaus breaks it, which is very annoying, but we will get there. However, irrespective of this, in all of these cases, the data are pointing to there being a hierarchy where the adjective is closer to the noun than the numeral is, and the demonstrative is yet further away. So whenever we get our experimental results through, they will tell us something. We know that the hierarchy is there, okay? That makes a very strong prediction now. That says that really what's going on is that Kitteraka speakers have that hierarchy. So we will expect those speakers to end up with homomorphic ordering effects in the artificial language learned in the held out cases. The only way around that is by saying that something else is going on, and that's not something that, we would have to, that makes the other analysis far more compelling. Okay, that's what I'm going to leave on. So I just want to finish, and more or less exactly an hour after I started, after all my technical problems. So I guess like the things I want to say that emerge from this are artificial language learning, I think, can really get you where you want to go. But really it needs to be done in tandem with good syntactic theory when you're doing it on languages where we don't really understand the syntax, right? That's true for typology in general, because typological results, of course, are not telling you more than what the surface order is. And as we saw way back on, the surface word order is subject to all sorts of things that are not necessarily what the syntax is. But there really is a syntax, right? And that syntax is something that we can get at using ALL. Okay, that's my whole thing.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much.
So I now need to figure out how I can make you guys big again. Ah, like that. There we go. Questions? Oh, there's a conversation going on. A meeting chart. Okay. Anything? Do you want me just to randomly talk?
No, we're all about awkward pauses.
Are you? Oh my God, I'm like such an extrovert. I hate awkward pauses. Okay, I'll do my best to shut up. This is why I always need to be in the audience to ask the questions. Although my colleague Coppa was threatened to buy a Nerf gun to shoot me with when I ask questions first. And I have learned to live with awkward pauses, although this is really not showing that. Right.
Okay, well, while people are thinking of their questions, I have a kind of very general one that I would like to get your take on. So I know you talked a bit about this issue of things that are kind of absolute universals versus statistical universals, and you and I have had many discussions about this. But I do think that one of the sort of fundamental issues with using artificial language learning is that, you know, if you're a syntactician who's fundamentally more interested in absolute universals and isn't particularly interested in understanding why some things are more common than other things, then, I mean, effectively, I feel like this paradigm is not particularly useful. It's not really going to be able to get you there. I mean, that may not be entirely true, but I mean, what I have behind that is you can only test it on humans, and humans have a language already. And so they will have, you know, yeah, they will have experience of those things that you think are universal by virtue of having a language. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about that. I mean, I'm a person who's interested in understanding why some things are more common than others. So I don't have that problem, but yeah, I'm wondering what you think.
I mean, I guess one point is I'm interested in many things. So, you know, I mean, like it's, you know, like, I mean, the linear versus hierarchical structure debate is a debate I'm very interested in.
Sure.
Something you can really get your teeth into with respect to this. So yes, I mean, the larger cog sci type questions, I think, are things that are more easily addressable with, or more easily.
Yeah, I mean, what you have is two alternative hypotheses, right? Exactly. And when you have a case of that, you know, if there's differences differences between theories in how to explain a particular thing, and that has implications for how people behave in an experiment, then you're all set.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, you know, I mean, in general, like that was kind of what happened as well, right? I was like, ooh, gaps, you know, can you get this? And I'm like, damn. And then I'm like, ooh, cool, like linearity, that works.
Fundamentally, people will basically be able to learn anything. So you're not going to bring people into the lab and explode their brains, you know, by exposing them to a pattern that's.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? So, you know, I mean, there is, for example, like the work on ALL and neural signals that people put together, which is kind of intriguing, showing that different bits of the brain light up with different kinds of things you can do with ALL. But the particular paradigm you're talking about, it is a deep challenge to figure out. I mean, because, you know, I mean, it is just a fact that, you know, you can rank your weak constraint really low, right? Or really high or whatever, right? And you will get the effect of having a strong constraint, and it's thereby architecturally difficult. I mean, that was sort of the point of my, you know, which girl did you say when left type example, right? I mean, you know, a typical generative explanation of that is highly abstract and, you know, and it's very challenging to take that level of abstractness and compare it with an alternative theory of that and be able to know which one is going to be able to determine between these two theories on any experimental basis, to be honest, I think, right? I mean, there are some cases, so some theories of these things involve parsing effects, right? So you might be able to use alternative experimental approaches to see whether you can control for parsing effects and say, okay, it's that or not, and that work's been done. Ditto syntactic satiation effects, and whether you get these syntactic satiation effects with different everyone knows what those are, right?
I doubt it.
No? So syntactic satiation effect is, if you guys have ever read or done some work in syntax and you keep reading the same example and you're like, God, this is really getting better and better and better. This is totally fine, right? Okay, that's syntactic satiation, and it tells you that some things, some effects, kind of go away as your brain gets better and better at figuring out how to deal with it. Other effects don't, right? So you can experimentally show that certain syntactic satiation effects stay there, okay? So there's an interesting question about those two kinds of effects, right? One of them seems to be that your parser gets used to it and then figures out what it wants to do with that and provides a representation. The other one seems to be harder for your parser to get hold of. So you can imagine using those kinds of paradigms. In fact, John Sprice and others have used those kinds of paradigms to show that actually certain kinds of islands are impervious to parsing type explanations. That work has its problems, and you know, there's a big debate there, but there are ways experimentally into those kinds of questions. Ditto, there's ways into questions about, you know, the extent to which things can be dealt with via analogy or not. I think that that's an area that ALL can work with. So, you know, if there's a particular kind of thing that is susceptible to an analogical generalization that UG would rule out, and you teach a language where and I mean, this is actually the held out paradigm basically in a sense, where the analogical generalization will give rise to an expectation which is ruled out putatively by UG. That might work, but of course it doesn't necessarily tell you that that cell in the paradigm is an impossible cell, right? What it tells you is that there could be, I mean, the theory makes the right predictions, but it doesn't tell you another theory that is not possible that will also make those kinds of predictions. So I think you're right, Jenny, that ALL is not necessarily a good way of teasing out those two theories, right? I think it is a reasonable way of teasing out analogical theories of language learning versus non-analogical theories of language learning. So for example, a construction grammar type approach versus inherent internal bias type approach. But again, that will depend upon how much you get to appeal to within your construction approach about what else is ruling out the relevant cell in your paradigm, right? That is there a plausible non-linguistic analysis that will rule out that cell? So these are I think exactly where, you know, some of the questions lie with trying to figure out how to harness the relationship between theory and experiment, right? This is why I wish generative syntacticians would read more construction grammar literature, because I think that's partly where the debate is, right? You know, and I think there are really, I mean, if you can hammer both theories down, there are ways of tackling, right? And it also means, you know, that the generative theories might see data where they're like, oh, actually, I don't need my theory to explain this. This is dealt with by something outside of UG, right? Which is very minimalist because it allows you to reduce UG, right? By saying, okay, well, this is a parsing effect. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But, you know, I think there are plausible candidates for things that are UG effects and not parsing effects. I don't think that's true. I mean, the word order thing is more challenging. Ooh.
David, just I'm mindful of the time, and there are a couple of questions. So okay. Can we maybe move on to student questions? Elizabeth?
Sure. Hi. I'm glad that my question is coming right now because it is related to something you just said about construction grammar. You were talking about how psychologists think that transitional probabilities are maybe, like, I don't know, more important than linguists do, but that transitional probabilities issues reminded me of these emergent grammar theories like construction grammar, where, you know, these constructions or units or whatever emerge kind of in frequency chunks, like based on the frequency of co-occurrence, these constructions sort of emerge. And that makes me think that this transitional probability thing is maybe not completely wild. Like so I don't know, I'm curious whether you think that those things are related, or what you think about the transitional probability issue in more detail, maybe.
Great question. I mean, I think there are, I mean, it's without doubt there's transitional probabilities, right? I mean, that's just a fact, yeah. And it may be the case that they are useful for certain kinds of things. I think they're probably extremely useful for parsing. Jenny thinks they're useful for some other things, maybe not. Maybe not transitional probabilities, but anyway, I absolutely think that probabilities are relevant for certain aspects of explanations of stuff. I think that the PNES paper that Jenny and I published makes them as an explanation for what is going on in terms of how English speakers store their knowledge about modifiers of noun phrases really unlikely, especially when we look at the work the whole team did afterwards, right, showing that, you know, something is going on here. One counter argument you could imagine is that, you know, well, one of those paradigms used a true artificial language. That's the one that showed you that your artificial language, that your UG was, or whatever it is being pulled into play. The other one maybe still was just transitional probabilities. I think that argument is makeable, but it becomes weaker, right? Because we know that speakers are some speakers at least are using the hierarchy. But why, in which case, why are they not using the transitional probabilities between the words when those words are English words, right? The words in the PNES study were that and striped and large and 3 and so on, right? And you can imagine this between word categories, but we tested those, and it's not between word categories either. So, you know, I mean, so it seems that although transitional probabilities are certainly a fact, the question is, how are they used? And it looks like they're not being used to store grammatical information, right? Doesn't mean to say they're not there. I think they almost certainly are there. I mean, you can measure them, they're there. But what are we doing with them? Now, in terms of the emergent theories of grammar, so, you know, I mean, I've chatted to Adele, for example, about this, and also to Ben Ambridge, who does kind of construction grammar-based language learning work. And when I give them examples where I sort of, you know, so one of my favorite examples is one from my Language Unlimited book, which is about recursiveness of possessors, right? So you can say John's friend's mother's cat. And it turns out if you look typologically, languages either have one possessor or an unbounded number of possessors they can use. And if you look at input to kids, generally the maximum number of possessors they hear is 2. Okay, so if you look at child S, for example, they hear 2. It's a really interesting typological question. Why don't, if you allow linear structures, transitional probabilities, why do kids not just learn some languages have 2 possessors, right? And they stick with that grammar, and then languages drift towards 2 possessors. That's a kind of interesting question, especially as we know that kids can subitize, so they can use other aspects of their cognition to understand the difference between 2 and 3, right? So they know those are kind of innate numbers in a sense. Crows can do that, snakes can do that, right? So it's really interesting, like what's going on there. Why don't they do that? And I ask Adele or I ask Ben, and they're like, oh, it's because the semantics is recursive, which is bollocks. The semantics is not recursive. I mean, unless you stipulate the semantics to be recursive. So, you know, I think there's no, I mean, one of the things I find when you look at emergent theories of grammar and construction grammar, and there is a problem of that sort where, you know, where conservativity of learning wars with or connects with analogical reasoning to give you the wrong results. The appeal then is not to the syntax doing something, but rather to some other aspect of cognition doing that thing. And to me, that may well be true, but it seems very hand-wavy. I mean, I have an explanation of why you get recursive structures, because there is no linear structure in grammar. It's all recursive. You can't do it, right? You can't do it linearly. My theory predicts that. Their theory does not predict that. I feel the onus is on them. Okay, the onus is on me in other places, right? So they're like, oh, pragmatics can explain why certain theories that say you can't focus inside a topic, that explains certain kinds of island effects when you list certain things as topics. I actually think that explanation is incorrect, but that's still the onus is on me then, because then there's an alternative explanation. And when I say, you know, to Ted Gibson, who believes this, well, in what sense is your linking hypothesis that says relative clauses are obligatory topics and focalized DP and WH elements are obligatory foci, and that's why you can't have WH elements inside relative clauses? Can you say all of this to me without using the words WH element and relative clause, and actually topic and focus, they have a hard time doing that, right? Yeah.
Sorry. Just there's one last question that I would like to get to just before because we're almost out of time. So someone in the chat has asked if you have experience investigating syntax and ALL through psycholinguistic approaches. I wonder if this is maybe more about if you have an idea about an interpretation of that question, maybe about the parsing stuff you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I try to be very multidisciplinary, but like this is an area that I have very little experience of. I mean, most of the experimental work I've done with syntax has been basically, just being more formal about judgment task collection and design of experiments, and then someone clever doing the statistics, so I don't need to. And so, I mean, that's basically the work I've done. I mean, other people have absolutely done these kinds of other things. So, I mentioned in my response to Jenny that there are people who do artificial language learning and then connect it also to neural work, looking at what fires up when you do when you teach someone an impossible language, for example. So there's that early classic study by Morrow, which has its issues, but like there's later work that. There's also work by Baggio. What is his first name again? Josia Baggio, who's in Trondheim, I think. Yeah, and he's done some very interesting work on this as well. That's my door again. That's very annoying. Which I think I wrote a blog about somewhere, but it's very cool psycholinguistic and ALL work. So I think there is other work out there, but I have not actually been lucky enough to be involved in any of that at the moment.
I think if there are some students who are interested in that, they should also talk to Maura during one of the breaks, because that. Can
I run and get that door again?
Yes, but shall we thank you, and then you can hop back.
Yeah,
but
we
thanks
can
very much.
go, actually.
All right, guys. Listen, I'm gonna run.
Thank you, David.
Thanks so much for this. Take care. Bye.
Okay, see you later.